morning, everybody. It's Mrs. Kelsulis and Mrs. Zimmerman again, and it's Shades Day in sixth grade math. We thought, it's a beautiful day, and I even went out on the back deck this morning, but the birds were so noisy, I was going to compete, so I decided to pull it back in. So here we are, and we are spreading our sunshine to your home. We're learning today some things with rational numbers and absolute value. So Mrs. Zimmerman's going to get us started. And Mrs. Zimmerman, what do you have for us today?
Oh, hi, Mrs. K. All right, so here's what I have today, you guys. So if you remember last week, do you remember, Mrs. K, my beautiful drawing?
I do, and it makes me think of your fish every single time I see
know, they're doing great. Actually, Thomas and I changed the water yesterday, cleaned the rocks, so, they're just doing well. So,
that's good.
It is. You guys remember my drawing, right? Last week, I taught you integers, and Mrs. K, what do we call it when it's right at the water right here? What is that called?
Oh, that's called sea level.
Yeah, sea level, right? You guys remember? So my fish was 8 feet below sea level, which meant it was a -8. And then my birds were 30 feet above sea level, so that was a +30. And then we don't have to write the positive sign. So last week we did integers, which is any number and its opposite, right? So, positive, negative. So what we're going to do today is, for you guys, I have another picture. So I have my fish below water. And today my fish is a little bit more active. It's kind of getting after things a little bit. And my fish is 13.5 feet below sea level. 13.5. So we know if it's below sea level, it's going to be negative, right?
Right.
So I could write 13.5 like that. A mixed number, a negative mixed number. Guess what we're doing today? Negative fractions and decimals. They're called rational numbers. Okay, so I'll write that out just so you can see it. And there it is, kind of squished. But here's what we're dealing with, rational numbers. So we're taking the same integers we did last week, the negatives and positives. This time we're throwing in some fractions and decimals. And I know sometimes you kind of freak out when you see fractions and decimals, but you don't need to, because it's like regular numbers. You just put it on a number line, you look at it, there's nothing scary about fractions and decimals. We've been doing them all, right? An expert. So this will be easy for you. So the first example I have for you is right here. Hopefully you can read it. How about now?
Yep, we can see it back a little bit further. There you go. Now we can see 0.
Oh, there we go. I see it. Okay. So my directions on this first problem are to graph 3/4 and its opposite. And I have a number line down here. Okay. That's going to be the best way to start. So when you're doing these problems with us here, I would get out a piece of paper and a pencil and start by just drawing yourself a number line. Okay. And we're going to graph 3/4 and its opposite, which we did the same thing last week with whole numbers. So it's going to be pretty easy. The thing you're going to have to pay attention to is how you number your number line. Okay. So my fraction is 3/4. Okay. Which means everything is going to be out of fourths. That's how you can think about your number line. Okay. So we'll start with the positive side of my number line first. And the very first fourth I have is 1/4. And then after that, I have
2/4.
Yeah. 3/4.
3/4.
4/4. 5, right? It goes on and on and on. So eventually you'll have a number line that looks like this. 1/4, 2, okay? Now, Mrs. K.
Oops, you have 5/6, Mrs.
Oh,
Zimmerman.
Mrs. K, I'm so glad you got that.
Well, I know you were just trying to make sure I was paying attention.
I honestly was.
The old lady over here could have fallen asleep. So
I'm just keeping you on your toes.
yeah.
Okay, that
Okay.
looks better. So,
Oh, I love it. Thank you.
yeah. Okay, so what I was going to ask Mrs. K is 2/4 is also what?
1/2.
1/2.
Mhm.
So you could
But-
write it either way.
Yeah,
Right?
but I don't, Mrs. Zimmerman,
But
because
we just keep it.
yeah, because it's all in fourths, and isn't
That
it
makes it
easier to
easier.
count that way?
Yep. Then we know we're all in the same. Okay. So now I have to graph 3/4. Well, my 3/4 is right there. So we're going to put a dot on 3/4. Boom, just like that. Okay. Now the opposite of that, remember you just do the exact same thing, just negative on the other side. So I'm
Yeah,
going
we
to
call that reflection, Mrs. Zimmerman. We're
Yes.
reflecting like a mirror.
Yeah.
We're going to be doing some reflecting next week in math.
Good vocab. All right. So here's my negative. So I've got my negative side and my positive side. My directions say to graph 3/4, which we did. And the opposite of positive 3/4 is negative 3/4.
Can you check, Mrs. Zimmerman,
Yep.
the steps? Let's jump from
Yep.
0 to 3/4 and see how many jumps that is, because the opposite should be exactly the same.
same. Okay. So let me draw this here. We've got. Okay, so we can check, like Mrs. K said. So here's my 3/4, right? And to get to 0, it's 1,
1,
2,
2,
3. Okay. And so now we can check our negative, our opposite. How many jumps is it going to be? 1,
1, 2,
2, 3.
3. Perfect.
They're the same. So we know we got it right. All right, Mrs. K, I got another one for you.
Oh, good.
So this time I have graph -1 and 1/10 and its opposite.
Ooh, so we got a negative number this time.
We're starting with the negative, and do you remember, if you can say it, you can write it. So I have -1 and 1/10, which is like what, Mrs. K?
1/10 is a fraction. We can just write
fraction.
it. Yeah.
Like that.
Oh, cool. Well, then
Right?
that's just like the last problem, Mrs. Zimmerman.
You're catching on. Okay, so our first number is negative that we have. So I'm going to start on the negative side of my number line, and I'm going to count by tenths. Okay. So,
Okay.
Mrs. K, while I fill out my number line, Mrs. K has a few things to tell you about your last week's assignment. So go for
Right.
it.
So what we've been impressed with is those of you who have questions, you've been clever enough to email us and ask us if you have questions. And so when that happens, we're here. We're checking our email. You just need to do that. We're here for you. The other thing we noticed from last week is you had worked on the Kahoot. The Kahoot was that's an assignment that we put into our IC. And so we found that some of you did Kahoot a couple times, and that's okay. We're fine with that. We just took the score that was bigger, better for your grade. So just keep in mind, we're giving you things that you can practice. If you get stuck, look at those videos again. I know we get old, but you're going to have to do that, because we're not there to repeat what we normally repeat to you in class. So anyway, that's where we're at right now. Make sure that you stay in contact with us if you need help.
Yes.
So Mrs. Zimmerman is now graphing her tenths. Remember, previous problem was fourths. Now she's doing tenths. She has a mixed number, and so she has to remember that one whole when she gets to that point.
Yeah.
Okay? And then once she graphs the negative side, she's got to graph the positive side. So how are you coming there, Mrs. Zimmerman?
Oh my goodness, it's gonna look like a lot.
Holy cow.
Holy smokes, don't freak out. Okay, so what I'm gonna do first is I'm gonna fold my graph in half so that way we're not too freaked out, okay? So here's my negative graph, okay? We're counting by tenths. So I did negative 1/10, 2, I just went on and on and on. And then it kind of got a little squished, but you can see that I have negative 10 tenths. And then after that, I have negative 1 1/10.
Now,
Yep.
excuse me.
Yep.
So a negative 10 tenths, is 10 tenths equal to 1 in the negatives too?
Yeah, just like in the positives. So 10
So that would be a negative 1.
1. So we could also,
Okay.
yeah, good question. So it could also be a negative 1 right there in that spot. So then the next one would be negative 1 1/10, negative 2 2/10, right? You see? Okay, so my direction was to graph negative 1 1/10, which as you can see is right here on my number line. So I'm going to put my dot right there at the very end, right there.
Yep.
Okay.
Looks
All right.
good.
So now I've got the positive side of my graph. Okay. And I did the exact same thing. I started at 0 and I've got 1, 2, all the way up. And here's my 10 tenths again, which is just like what, Mrs. K?
1.
1.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's my 1. And then my next is 1 1/10, 1 2/10. It goes on and on. So my opposite of a negative 1/10 is positive 1/10. Just like that.
And that 1 1/10 mixed number could be written as a decimal, correct?
Yeah.
To match our problem.
Yep. So you could do it either way when you're making your number line. You know, if fractions work better for you, or if you see it as decimals, you could do it that way too.
Okay.
Okay? All right. Now, just like the last problem, you can always check your answer and count how many spaces to get to 0. So if we start with our negative 1 1/10, it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 jumps to get to 0.
Can you hold that up higher?
Yep, there we go.
Yeah.
I see it. See how I did that? I got to 11 jumps to get to 0. And if we do the same thing on this side, we're going to jump 11 times back to 0.
Perfect.
All right? Okay. So that's how you graph rational numbers. And the next thing I'm going to show you is how to compare them. So if you remember last week, Mrs. K taught you how to compare integers, right, using our little alligator mouths. And so this week, we're going to compare fractions. Okay, so I have a negative 4/7 and a negative 1/7. And we want to figure out which one's going to be bigger. So what I'm going to do is draw a number line again. Now, you don't have to draw a number line with these ones. Okay, if you can see it in your head and you know you can picture which one's going to be bigger, you can do that. That's just fine. But me, you guys know I need to write everything out. So I'm going to draw a number line. So I'm going to count by sevenths because it's negative 1/7 and negative 4/7. And this time, because we're dealing with two negative numbers, I just decided to do the negative side of my number line just to save some time. Okay. So the best thing you could do now is just to look at these two numbers and graph them. I have a negative 4/7. I counted by sevenths. So my negative 4/7 is going to be right there. And then my negative 1/7 is going to be over here. Right?
Okay, so
Yeah.
I'm just thinking more like, because these kids are getting closer to 7th grade.
Oh, yeah.
If I had two fractions that had two different denominators, let's say I had like 2/3 and 2/3, -4/7. What would you recommend I do?
Well, if you guys remember back earlier this year when we compare different things, what do we always have to do when we compare? We have to get them to be the same. So, common denominator, Mrs. K. You got to
Yeah.
find a common denominator. That's what I would do.
Just like when we add or subtract fractions.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay.
Exact same thing. In order to compare, they got to match. So, these ones here match, so we're already there. So yeah, good point, Mrs. K. All right, so now if you remember right, with negatives, it's a little bit backwards, right? Because you might be thinking to yourself, well, automatically 4 is bigger than 1, so that one has to be bigger. But the reason we use a number line is to help us out, okay? Because the biggest number is going to be the one that's closest to 0. So my bigger one is actually -1/7. So,
And if you remember, they reflect. Negative numbers and its positive reflect, like a reflection in the water or reflection in a mirror.
yeah, it goes both ways. So there's my sign. -1/7 is going to be greater than -4/7. All right?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Now, drum roll, Mrs. A.
Is it a challenge problem?
Challenge problem. Get pumped, everybody.
Woohoo!
All right. So now that you know what you're doing, okay, you can graph in rational numbers and their opposites. You can compare irrational numbers. I've got a challenge problem for you. Okay, so we're comparing -3 8/100 and -3 8/10.
Do you want me to tell you what I think we should do, they should
Yeah.
do, or just let them figure it out and go on from there?
Oh yeah, we want to hear it, Mrs. K.
Okay, well, I know what I would do. I love to draw that imaginary 0 at the end to make them both hundredths. That's the easiest. I draw that little dotted 0 at the, yes.
Hey, look at
Because
that.
now we have each a whole number and we have both in hundredths. And so now it's easy to compare. It would be kind of a pain to graph that, Mrs. Zimmerman.
Yeah, I
Because
kind of
we have
would.
to do 80 hundredths.
All the way out.
100.
Yep. So here you go. You got 2 ways to solve it. Good luck.